Skeptic Site Podcast number 1. Seeking truth, beauty, goodness, wherever they can be found. I'm the host, Stephen Jones. My guest today will be Ryan Johnson, an old friend from college. I always thought, I want to get to know that guy better. He has things worth saying. A few years later, here we are. Ryan works on the cutting edge of communications technologies. But he also has a thoughtful and measured approach to spiritual matters that I've always appreciated. In this conversation, we managed to address, at least in part, almost everything, it seems. I hope that by listening in, you gain as much from it as I did.
To borrow a phrase from the first President Bush, lots of points of light out there that point in the right direction, I think. I hope our conversation is in that category. Because we're coming from something, inevitably. And in our case, it's a reasonably similar something, right? That sort of late 20th century American evangelicalism, particularly in its Midwestern, rural environment, where it seems to have done quite well for itself. The fact that we come from that background, I think, will probably color everything for the rest of our lives, right? Just as if we were still in it in a certain way.
Absolutely. As much as I really early on, for me, set about rejecting large portions of it and questioning other parts. Still, there are a few things that I actually want to hang on to. There are a couple things that I think are great, and some of those good things, when taken seriously, really taken to heart, are what led me to reject so much of the rest of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see that. I mean, for me, because of, at the end of the day, I'm a policy person more than a political person. I think that's a fair thing to say. But in any case, I kind of live in that realm, right, where we convert ideas into actions that affect, countries worth of people, right? Which is, I like my job. I think when I do it right, it's really cool. But I don't think I would have ended up here if I hadn't come from that evangelical background, right? Or certainly, well, I mean, if I'm honest, I don't think I would have ended up here if I hadn't had a lethal overdose of classes from one particular professor.
Oh, right. Okay.
I don't know how comfortable I am naming that person, frankly, but because I don't think that the person itself really matters, right? That's sort of an archetype that probably exists at every evangelical university, and even a lot of secular or public institutions, right?
The very dogmatic professor kind of has it all figured out.
The guy would walk,
really interested.
He had marcated steps in his classroom to the point where he would wear out the carpet because he'd been doing the exact same thing for 30 or 40 years. There's something almost beautiful about it, right? In a certain way, but it was a frail and rigid system that he developed for himself that just couldn't adapt, or not even adapt. It couldn't accept the possibility of things that were contrary to that very narrow set of beliefs. And so, coming from that and the getting a very major dose, I won't say a healthy dose because I don't think it was healthy, but a major dose of that changed the way I thought about politics and what could be done. And ultimately, I mean, I think there's a bit of a rubber band snapping back after it's been stretched in some unnatural way. I broke through all that and came back to something that still retain some of that shape, right, of what I think the political system can do. Um, but it's vastly different from, the conclusions derived from the way of are are drastically different. Uh, you know, in college, I was one of the founders of the college libertarians at our school.
Really?
Yeah, um, which was, I mean, I think deep down, I still would be a libertarian if I thought everybody could afford to be one. Like the ideals of I get to be me and you get to be you, and like so long as we're not stepping on each other's toes, everything's fine. I still think are beautiful.
Yeah.
Uh, Particularly the economic policy associated with that um, assumes that we can all start from some kind of level playing field. That just isn't the case, right?
It's very difficult to make the libertarian ideal actually work in reality.
Exactly right. And yeah, I mean, as a thought experiment, you could talk about like resetting it on a generational basis, right? Sort of
Mm,
capping wealth transfer or something, and making sure that everybody did have a chance to succeed and reap certain benefits of their success. But in reality, people with power always seek to preserve that power for themselves,
right.
right? I mean, always being kind of a blanket, I guess, statement, but there are examples of people not doing that. But the general status of the world is that people accumulate power and try to hold on to it and maybe pass it to their children, or to their clan of whatever, and that leads to systematic inequalities, right? In the U.S. in particular, there's racial inequalities that are baked into our system, and so I think when I realized that I just couldn't be a libertarian, right? Like there's work to do before we could all be libertarians, and until we all can benefit from that kind of a system and take advantage of it in the ways that I myself would like to, it doesn't make sense, or it doesn't seem right to try to implement that. So I gave up on that. Which sounds, I mean, it's a little bit like a kind of a pseudo Marxist kind of like, we're going to do this deeply pro state thing to get to this anti state end. Uh, but that's kind of where I think I ended up, right? Which is, I ended up
Yeah.
with some very progressive positions that require state action because nobody else can do it effectively.
Right.
Not that the state's always an effective actor. I still retain a certain amount of skepticism of the ability of the state, but I think that's healthy, and I don't think that precludes me from being a progressive. But that's where I ended up, right? Which is this kind of went from one end of the spectrum to another in terms of what I think the role of the state is. But still would like to end up back where I started, just with everybody there, right?
One of the classic principles um, that we have always maintained is necessary um, for the longevity of a republic is that the state takes some role in protecting the powerless against the powerful.
Right.
That's not even a progressive idea. That's classic conservative republicanism.
Yeah. I mean that's true, right? Which is the other thing that I think we don't pay enough attention to is the dramatic shift that's happened. I mean, kind of in only about 40 years,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, there's a clean demarcation between what the Republican Party meant to a voter for Richard Nixon as compared to a voter for Ronald Reagan,
Right.
right? So somewhere around there is when that shift really seemed to happen. Reagan was leading a kind of an insurgency in the party before his presidency, but let's kind of call that where the coming out party for whatever that is, and it seems to be a far right um, view, right? I mean, in other countries, that would be considered a far right position, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it's become pretty normalized in the United States. And it's got that pseudo libertarian bent of keeping government out of my business as long as I'm, like a white male, right? Then it can't be in my business, but it can really be in everybody else's business. That's where we're at. That's what this administration represents, right?
Yeah,
Um,
it's very neoliberal.
yeah, and it's tied in with all sorts of um, class and race and gender issues, identity issues in general that make it very clear from the get go. And in fact, some of the strategy employed by the Republican Party to consolidate its gains in the South are inevitably tied to race. Um, so we can't argue that that's just something that happened in America. No, the Republican Party went about crafting that coalition and promoting an alliance with religion, particularly with evangelicals, but a little bit with Catholics and a little bit with certain more conservative leaning Jews. But the backbone of that for the Republicans has been the evangelicals, who have become this sort of unwavering base of support, even to the point of absurdity, right? I
Hmm.
mean, you have evangelicals supporting a president who's the farthest thing from what they would have endorsed in a leader 4 years ago. You know, um, Bill Clinton was absolutely reviled by the evangelicals, and yet he's a guy that kind of owned his couple of big mistakes. Certainly, it's impossible to pretend that Bill Clinton's a perfect person, but when you compare, him to Donald Trump on sort of the evangelical weighted scale, you kind of go, well, Clinton wasn't so bad, and yet here we are with evangelicals, completely flocking behind Trump. It's bizarre to me. It does always feel like I'm living in like a Twilight Zone episode or something, right?
Yeah, it's bizarre to me that they don't see anything strange about it.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow there's been this this magical spell,
Yeah.
where they're not even able to see this dramatic turnaround. I can see it um, even in my parents to a degree. You
Mm-hmm.
know, um, like uh, like I'm holding them to the very things they used to hold me to that they've shifted away from.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
So the question that comes to my mind about that, right? And there's a lot of us who I think are looking at our parents uh, and just kind of go, what the hell happened? Right? Like,
Right?
so I guess where I go with that is like, what's the, I guess, psychological impact, right? Of seeing our parents kind of betray the general worldview they instilled in us, right? Even if we
Yeah.
rejected that worldview already, we always thought mom and dad still believed what they said,
Mhm.
right? And now maybe they don't somehow, or something else is different.
Yeah. Like it seems, and there are multiple things going on here, of course, right? There are multiple coinciding threads in this pattern, but it seems that one of those is some people have become so tied up in a certain set of values and they've come to see those as being so threatened that they're willing to ignore the others,
Yeah.
at least for now, for the sake of this other concern. I mean, that's very vague because I'm not being specific about what those values are because I don't think it's that clear. I don't think they're that
No, it's a
set in
general
stone.
sense, right? Like people sort of say, uh, Christianity's under attack. It's persecuted church in America, and you kind of go, well, how, right? Like what jackbooted thugs came into your Sunday service in middle Indiana and said you can't do this anymore, or even really stopped you from celebrating outside the church, right? Um, I mean, it's fair to say that there's been a decrease in the dominance of Christianity on sort of the American stage in general, but I think it makes it more reflective of the people of America, right? Like, it's perfectly fine to say happy holidays because there's a reasonable chance, almost half, that the person you're speaking to celebrates perhaps holidays in addition to or exclusive of Christmas. So, who are you really hurting, right? Like, I don't get it. To me personally, that was always like, even a decade ago, when I think I was still, well, 15 years ago, when I was still very much more in an evangelical mindset, that to me still rung kind of hollow, right? Like, it's like, that's just clearly
Yeah.
designed to make people feel something, like a bad praise and worship song, right? There's no meat there. It's just, did it give me a little bit of shiver in my spine and make me feel like I want to do something? And for enough people, apparently it did. Um, so that's kind of where I think I left all of that, right? And without going into a long explanation of it, I think a lot of it stopped with, I think the first thing that fell apart for me was some of the social justice issues, right? Particularly the treatment of homosexuals, treatment of the poor, of colored people, the idea that, it was fine to go and help poor people in another country, but we certainly didn't want them here, right? And then I started examining a lot of things. And so, biblical literalism fell off pretty quick. I don't think I ever was a proper biblical literalist. Like, I
It's
always knew
hard
there
to
was
be.
something had to be, massaged there, right? Like, I've seen some people, I've spoken to some people that are like true literalists, and I go, okay, well, that was never where I was. Um, but there were other, there were some things in there where I kind of go, yeah, okay, Jonah and the whale, that one doesn't have to be true for me to still have some kind of faith, right?
Right.
And then you start peeling it back to the bare essentials.
Hmm.
And I think re reevaluating my relationship with the Bible because of its primacy in the faith, right?
Yeah.
Um, changed my relationship with my faith pretty profoundly,
Yeah.
right? Like, I became, you know, I rank ordered, if you will, sort of the sections of the Bible, and if anything comes in remote tension with the gospel, then I'm going to side with the gospel, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
And so, a lot of the Old Testament's gone, right? Like, I just don't have any need for this because it's either unhelpful or worse. The epistles, you kind of go, well, these are people trying to figure it out. I don't think that they got it all right.
Right.
Um, so okay, helpful guidance, some nice thoughts, but not necessarily the only way we can organize ourselves. And so, uh, yeah, I ended up being left with more or less the gospel, right? I mean, not a bad place to be. There's
Yeah.
enough meat there, plenty to dwell on, and to think about how to organize my own life, and then the way that society should be organized, right?
Absolutely.
And so, because I have that sort of political environment that I'm in, um, you know, I'm inevitably, I think I'm drawn to some of the political implications
Yes.
of Jesus's life and message. Um, I personally, I haven't given up in terms of coming down to the bare bones of what I believe. I still believe that there has to be some reason for all of existence, and
Yes.
that to me suggests that there's a God, right? That there's
Right.
something outside of the system, or at least so deeply connected to all parts of the system that it can give us that meaning. The idea of a meaning suggests some general direction for the universe to try to move in, right?
Yeah. I'm
I,
with
I
you.
don't I don't get a lot more descriptive about it. Unfortunately, I wish I could paint a more beautiful picture there, but I think that's kind of where I go. That's about what I know, right? I still believe that Jesus was at least part of that part of that God, or part of that, like, or somehow more closely tied to that piece of the universe that runs through everything than the rest of us are, right? Like he got it right.
Yeah,
How
he
he
in
got it,
some
I don't
way
know.
represents it.
Yeah, and so that still gives Jesus some kind of primacy for me. I don't. I think I gave up a long time ago on this idea that like people are fallen and need to be saved. Like that fell away pretty quick because that just it stops making sense if we cut down to the bone of what Jesus' message was. I don't think it's really there. It was pretty easy to get rid of penal substitution. That came away with just getting rid of the guilt framework of evangelicalism. I
Yeah,
was
it
like, oh,
doesn't take much to jettison that one.
no, it didn't at all. I almost didn't recognize it. You know what I mean? It was
Yeah.
such a light load by the time I got rid of it that I was like, yeah, I guess I don't really believe that anymore because it didn't make sense anymore. I just you
Hmm.
shed it naturally. But so yeah, I guess that's kind of in terms of where my faith has gone from certainly a much more detailed picture, right? I mean, evangelicalism and sort of even mainline Christianity to a large extent try to give you all the answers, but they're not necessarily good answers, right? So
Right.
if you're happy just to have some answer that you can cling to, I guess it's okay. But I wasn't. Um, so I got rid of a lot of the stuff that just turned out to not have a lot of basis and not make a lot of sense.
It's very hard to be a thinking person and be at peace in that system.
Yeah, and it's not one that I mean. I had some good pastors at at the church I grew up in that I think tried to connect me with good resources,
Hmm.
right? So they allowed me to at least explore within the sandbox, which was good.
Yeah.
But it still was sort of a well, this is Thomas Aquinas and he says some things, but he's Catholic, so take that with a grain of salt. Well, you know, the guy was onto some things, and so what I sense though, I think a lot of the people who have had similar experiences come away with a sense of like that part of our development was stunted in a way, right? Or that something
Yeah.
was kind of robbed from us, even in
Yes.
terms of because we were in this sandbox and we were told that was the whole world, right?
Hmm.
That it's all been mapped out and here's all you need to do and you can go and explore and like the mystics are over there, be careful, and like the Catholics are over there, but generally speaking, like if you stay this side of Wesley, you're going to be okay. Uh, and it's not a horrible place. There's probably plenty of nice things about it, but
Hmm.
when you're told that's the whole world, and then you realize that it's actually much bigger than that, and you break down the walls of the sandbox a bit, you get this sense that maybe it's almost like a betrayal, isn't it? That people who you trusted didn't
Yeah.
give you the whole deal. They didn't have it either, right? I mean, they earnestly
Yeah.
believed this, and so why
For the
would they?
most part, you know.
Yeah, there are some vile people in there as well, right? That
Yeah.
manipulate
There
actively, but
always are.
yeah, but I think in general, it's a lot of well-meaning people who are just not entirely right.
And that's one of the struggles with dealing with so much of the harm that has come to people. Um, it seems like an awful lot of people about our age and then
Mm-hmm.
younger, right?
Yeah.
Um, who really came of age after that, like political co-opting
Mm-hmm.
of evangelicalism. There's been so much harm done to so many people,
Yeah.
and it's tricky because it's hard to blame any one person or any set of people because most of them have no idea how co opted they are. Most
Right.
of them genuinely mean well and don't realize the harm they're causing.
Exactly right. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I know some people that come from an evangelical background, end up with a great deal of anger. And I don't think I've got that because of what you said. I mean, I don't think anybody around me intended to do me harm or intended to control me, right? Not like that. I mean, I think they don't recognize it anyways.
Mhm.
I think the control is there, particularly in relationships with children and youth. It is about control, um, but I don't think it was intentional. And so, I can't be too upset about it. But I don't know. I understand. I understand the frustration that other people feel too. Right. I just
Luckily, we're both straight, relatively well intelligent white guys. We
yeah.
managed to come away pretty unscathed.
Very true.
I would imagine had I been hurt by it more, it would be a lot harder for me to just accept that these are well meaning people who are ignorant or deceived or whatever.
That is very true. Yeah.
But, you know, um, I understand that coming from a place of hurt. Uh, I've studied conflict an awful lot. That's one of my pet projects, how
Mm.
conflict works, and like villainizing the other,
Hmm.
and in the insistence on seeing oneself as a victim
Right.
is really core to how conflict functions and how it gets perpetuated.
Yeah.
It's really necessary for both sides to continue to see themselves as victims
Hmm.
in order for the conflict to continue. And unfortunately, very often, one of those sides is not the
Right.
victim, but has not been willing to listen and hear from the other how they've been the oppressor or how they've been harmful. And so, when the victim rightly stands up for themselves, you feel like victimized, right?
Right.
So there's often that thing, but also we just hold on to seeing the other as victimizer,
Hmm.
and it's very difficult to listen. And again, if you've been victimized, why would you want to listen to that person, right?
Yeah.
It's entirely justified to not want to listen to them. And yet, however, if you listen to those people, you discover that they're as broken as everyone else. They're
Hmm.
confused.
Yeah.
They're ignorant, you know, and I recognize that in myself. As I come to recognize my own privilege,
Hmm.
the ways in which I haven't always handled that really well because I was ignorant of it, um, that's one of the things I've had to come to terms with. On one hand, am I responsible for the things I've done? Yes. And on the other hand, I meant as well as I could the whole way.
Hmm.
I legitimately, with an appropriate asterisk, I legitimately was doing the best I knew how. And when my ignorance was cleared up for me, then damn it, I'm changing my behavior.
Yeah.
And I think that's true for most people. I think most people really are doing their best, and we're caught up in things that are bigger than us that cause us to be victimizers.
Hmm.
And I'm not trying to say that to excuse it. Like, of course
No,
not.
but that comes back to that idea that these are systematic problems, right? That just simply by participating at the station you're given at birth, you're contributing to, these pretty grievous societal problems. And how do you break that, right? Like, I don't think that I've seen yet a really good, applicable to many situations, sort of toolkit to help people know how to do that. Coming from a Washington, D.C. example, right? Georgetown University was discussing reparations. That's still just a completely untouchable subject for a lot of people, right? So
Right.
I think probably in the long run you end up, you either go there or something else that tries to help undo, hundreds of years of oppression and keeping people down based on the color of their skin, and then sort of general class structures that kind of derive from that.
Hmm.
So, you got to do something, right? Once you recognize the scope of the problem, it comes back to that sort of thing I was saying earlier, that while I'd love for everybody to end up being able to be libertarian, and until we can get to that point where everybody has that chance to really live the best version of that, we can't do it, right? So you got to do something. But how do you, like, I haven't seen a good way, for lack of a better term, a pop culture way, right? Uh, right? Like, there's been some very deep thinking done on this, but how do you translate that so that 300 million Americans will get it, rather than maybe like 3 million at best, right?
Right.
Because until you can make it appeal at the massive level, you can either try to do it through policy, which is going to be unpopular and so slow going at best, or you try to do it on one-off things like what Georgetown University did, which is fine, comes from the right place, but does it, like, it affected, I don't know, let's say 50 people, something, right? Some small number relative to the size of the problem. So what does it really accomplish? And can everybody participate at the small scale and make an impact, or is this something that really needs a more centralized approach? And my intuition is that it's the latter. That you have to have something that happens at least at the nation level.
Hmm.
Although, frankly, on a global scale, there's a lot of things that the system doesn't exist just in the United States. Right now, we're particularly focused on a particular racial paradigm of Northwestern Europe on top, and everybody kind of falling in a pyramid away from that, right?
Yeah, that's fair.
With this kind of like special carve out for American Indians, that even though genocide was okay, we kind of respect their spirit and we've idealized them in this way. It's bizarre. But, like, basically it's a hierarchy. And Italians are, a little bit, they're closer to Northwestern Europe, so they're a little bit better. Basically, they're rightful. We still, like, we reserve the right to have special racial slurs just for them.
Hmm.
What a horrible system. It's a little different on the global scale, but only a little. It's the same thing. It's just a different casting, right? And so, how do you deal with it at scale? I think is the problem that I find really interesting.
Hmm.
I don't think enough work has been done on. I don't know. I mean, maybe you've seen better resources than I have on how to approach it, but I've seen a lot of, like, really idealistic views that don't inevitably, or it's very hard for those to get traction because people see them as you're depriving me of something.
Right. We know really well how to work these issues out
Hmm.
amongst particular individuals or small groups.
Hmm.
But on a massive scale, I've never seen anything be
Yeah,
effective.
and
We can manage to turn around a nation's feelings about tobacco
yeah,
after after decades of fighting about it. All we
yeah,
had to do was run a massive shaming campaign,
yeah,
and suddenly, like, smoking becomes the dirty thing that only dirty people do,
yeah.
and now it's like virtually eradicated from the public sphere.
Almost, which is amazing because I mean, I grew up like you grew up in the '80s, where you could pretty much smoke everywhere,
Hmm.
right? And it was uncomfortable for some people, but it was their God-given right to smoke anywhere they wanted to. And now, in a very short period of time, I mean, I think it started around 2000, really, right? That was about when New York had its smoking ban, which I think was the first in the nation.
Yeah.
Other countries are slowly following suit. It seems to be. You're right. It's a good program. So how do you build a program that's public shaming around being an ordinary racist? I think we're good at public shaming like the vile racists, right?
Yeah, yeah. Like, I know I'm racist and I own it.
Yeah,
But when I don't think I'm racist, but my behaviors show otherwise.
I've got a black friend. I'm not racist. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's cool. But yeah, how do we build that program, and then I mean, you know, that was implemented at scale, right? That was implemented at city scale, at
Hmm.
state level. I don't know of it. Well, there probably are some countries even that have. Certainly, there are countries that have done it. You know, on a nationwide level. Generally, not countries as big as the United States, but whatever. So you know, once you figure out how to do that, it seems like it scales pretty well.
Hmm.
But I think it's ultimately going to have to, you know, repairing the damage done by this system probably requires doing more than just shaming, right? Like it requires some
Hmm.
proactive measures to put people back on an equal footing. That'll be seen by some people as because it's a relative diminishment of their capital in the system, right? It'll be seen as an actual reduction, even though it might be in fact generative for the whole system, right? So I have 1 million and you have nothing, and if we split the difference, we both end up with 750,000, right?
Hmm.
I mean, it's something like that in reality, but if I'm going from 1 million to 750, somehow I feel like that's a big loss.
Why should someone else benefit from what I've earned or
Yeah,
whatever, right? Like we always take more ownership over our good than is due.
yeah, it's convenient to do that. I can because if I built it, nobody can take it away from me, right? That's what we're
Right.
told.
Right.
Go and build a business, and it's all yours, and nobody can. So that's one of the things you have to attack, right? Is this sense of like
Hmm.
Elizabeth Warren really attracted me early on in her, not even her presidential campaign, right? This was when she was running for senator of Massachusetts. Was
Yeah.
that soundbite she had that was like, if you made a multi-million-dollar business, great, but you didn't pave the roads that the trucks run on, you didn't pay for the
Right.
firefighters and whatever, right? This idea that there is a collective reality to our economy,
Hmm.
that's a powerful affirmation, right?
Yeah.
And you see a lot of it right now in this most interesting time that we happen to live in. Uh,
Absolutely.
yeah, what a blessing.
We are being forced to reconcile with the fact that we have a shared lot and
yeah,
we are responsible for each other.
and the guy that you treat like trash that you know stacks carts at the grocery store actually has a job that matters to your well-being.
Yeah.
There's people who make like $8 an hour and are afraid that they're going to catch a life-threatening illness
Yep.
because they have to keep, you know, the 2 pallets of toilet paper they get every day stopped. The whole thing is bizarre to me. You know, I was reflecting a little bit on this today, and it's just that this is this. I thought the 2008 crisis. Well, first I thought September 11th would be the defining moment for our generation.
Hmm.
That didn't last very long because then we got the 2008 crisis,
Yep.
and now about a decade later, we have something that probably is going to be worse than both of those put together.
Yeah.
Right? Um, it, we seem to be unable to get real control over this. For people lucky enough to have significant, you know, retirement savings on the stock market, they've seen that decimated. Which, if you're a person approaching retirement age, that's the second time in a decade that half your wealth has been evaporated.
Right.
Like, how do you rebound from that?
Yeah, that's terrifying.
I mean, I'm at the age where I know it's going to impact me.
Hmm.
I'm fortunate that I have something, and there's a lot of other people in a far more vulnerable situation. All of the baby boomers who were thinking they would retire in the next 5 or 10 years.
Right.
A huge portion of the population is now probably going to have to think about working longer. Um, and you know, how does our government and how do our politicians react to that reality and break the news to them gently that there's not a big enough bailout for what they really need.
Uh,
Every politician's gut instinct is to kick the bad news can down the road as far as they can, hoping it'll go, past the next election and it'll be somebody else's problem. But I think this is one where you can't. And unfortunately, we have the worst government possible for that moment. Like we have one that's really good at kicking the bad news can, not even down the road, but just ignoring it altogether.
everything's fine. Everything's fine. Everything's going to turn out fine.
This will go away in April. It's fine. It's going to be like a miracle. Don't worry. History will not be kind to our political leaders in this moment. 100 years from now, there will be books written about this.
People will be having conversations exactly like ours, wondering how the hell we let this happen.
How did they not have? So maybe I'll tie this into one of the things that is a touch point for me in terms of what I believe and how I think the universe is shaped. I do believe that humanity is to be celebrated, right? And is something special. Um, and so when we live in a situation, a society where that many people, even after we pass the first law that it supposedly makes healthcare available to all citizens, we still have so many who don't have it and don't have enough of it. That's truly troublesome for me. And by the way, now those chickens are coming home to roost quite firmly, right?
Right.
Because the very people who are working at the grocery store or whatever to keep everything, the portions of the economy that can continue to move, particularly the consumer economy, those are the people who are now the most vulnerable, but they're also the people that are among the few people everybody else is interacting with.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very bad situation for everybody, right? And I hope that I don't think we will learn the lesson, by the way. I have a feeling like if this thing gets solved in the next month, we get a cap on the number of cases, we have, hashtag flattened the curve well enough. We'll look back at this and go, okay, that was bad, but, we don't need to take like expensive systemic reform. Certainly don't, we can't afford now to, after we bailed out the airlines, we just don't have the money to pay these people's health insurance or, to make sure that everybody has paid sick leave. I hope, not optimistically, but just because I have to hope for something, I hope that some of our political leaders will figure that out, that this is the only time, the only opportunity they're going to have to make that stand.
You should be struggling, 'cause we're all not suffering. You should be struggling, 'cause we're all not suffering. You should be struggling, 'cause we're all not suffering.
So I believe that about the world, right? That humanity is valuable and that all people are worth something, and that worth is not tied to what their financial picture looks like, right? What they've accumulated. All men are created equal, I think, is right. But I wonder if we do things that make us, in the moment at least, worth more or less. And I think that comes from the nature of the world itself, right? That we're all here in this together. We're all made of the same thing and connected in some deep way. I have trouble figuring out where the touchstone for that is, right? What the genesis of that belief really is for me. Certainly, there's enough thought that's been done, from a philosophical perspective, right? Work has been done on that, but how do I adapt that or integrate that into the way I look at the world? I don't know if that comes from a specific place or not. In your experience, how do you triangulate and link the different? You said there's about 10 things that you came down as bedrock of your framework for the world. How do you
Yeah.
link those together?
Most of my convictions, like when I was like generating this list, most of them involve like what is the nature of truth and beauty and goodness, and how do these things interact? So, for instance, one of the first affirmations I wrote down is Gandhi's assertion that ahimsa and satya, which is like truth and non-violence, like active, proactive non-violence, non-violence as like a generative lifestyle,
Mm-hmm.
that these two things presuppose each other and depend on each other.
Mm-hmm.
Truth does not
Hmm.
need to defend itself, but falsity must. Falsity has to assert itself, but truth just is. And so, of course, there's a rational
Mm-hmm.
component to that. But at the same time, it also just jives
Mm-hmm.
with work that I did in social work when I was studying how conflict works, and also just watching people's behaviors. When someone is acting in a way that we consider
Mm-hmm.
trustworthy, what does that look like?
Right.
It looks like vulnerability. It looks like someone who doesn't have to assert themselves. And so just observations about how our relationships work, but then how that reveals or seems to reveal something about the nature of reality itself. So I don't know that I can pinpoint like a specific origin for these things, but I just notice how they begin to gel over time. And I think it's easy for me because so many of my things just are so related to each other, as if they depend on each other to form this system, right? I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation. How did these things come together for other people? You know, where did they arise from? Because it's easy to say where you picked up an idea, but when we try to identify when on a gut
Mm-hmm.
level we
Mm-hmm.
shift in conviction, those are almost things that necessarily happen behind the scenes.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's just some things where you kind of turn around one day and go, oh, I guess this is where I'm at, right? The pieces were there, but somehow the construction happens when we're not looking. I like that concept of truth not having to assert itself. I think that's, but that kind of, it's the same thing, right? Like once something is in terms of the way you believe or the way you perceive the world, right? Then it is probably going to be just there, right? Self-evident to itself, and not having to create the frameworks and justify itself and build out some extensive uh, rational network to argument its existence.
Yeah.
If it's one of these sort of core things, then it will just be. That makes sense to me intuitively. A little hard to capture in terms of process. Right? Here's how you get to the bedrock of all knowledge. Do nothing. Just wait for it. But it makes sense. For me, I think I take the idea of, gosh, everything I'm going to say is going to sound so corny, but bear with me.
Sure.
Love as kind of like a central driving force in the universe, right? And love as the thing that connects
Yeah.
almost at a physical level, right? Connects all things, right? And so then for me, everything kind of builds off of that, right? What is generative to love, and what creates those positive feedback loops that create more of the positive, attribute of the universe. And it doesn't take long to realize that power structures and everything, literally everything related to sort of the consumer capitalist market system just don't have any place, right? Because they're all predicated on the idea that I can have more, I can do better, I can
Mm-hmm.
be superior in some way. And it creates structures that require people to buy into ideas that are, I think, patently false, like, the idea that all work somehow is noble, right? No, it turns out there's jobs that are just, that are horrible. We shouldn't be asking people to do them, right?
Mm-hmm.
We decided a long time ago that it wasn't right to ask children to put their small hands into machinery to clean out the clogs between the gears, because that wasn't right. But I think there's a whole list of things that we're asking people to do today that are, just as bad. And, some of it's just work that's
Yeah.
not generative to the human soul, right?
Yeah.
So there's a group of, I think this started in the 70s in Italy, if I'm not mistaken, but it's still kind of bubbling along in Europe. They call themselves like the luxury communists. I don't know if you've heard of these people.
No.
Yeah, it's interesting. So their idea is that we should actually proactively automate all work, right? And get rid of work
Wow.
generally, right? If you want to do something, fine, do, right? If you want to be a researcher in a specific thing, go and do that. But in general, like most work is bunk, right?
That seems almost inevitable, but they're advocating for doing this intentionally.
Yeah. So a long time, actually, when I was still in undergrad, I started thinking about like the future of work, right? And what policies and what conditions would happen. And I came to the decision that we would ultimately either automate ourselves back into the dark ages or into like a new enlightenment, right? Like I think it's kind of binary.
Mm-hmm.
We get one or the other depending on how we frame it, how we structure it.
Yeah, I think it depends on how we either consolidate or distribute power when it happens.
Exactly. That's entirely the thing. So right now we're consolidating, which I think leads us back to the dark ages. Uh, you know, somebody brought up the idea that some of the things that are happening in the modern economy, particularly related to the work being done around coronavirus, ultimately result in like a neo-feudalistic kind of economy, right? That we're not really capitalists anymore. We're kind of like so much power and wealth is controlled at the top, and people have no option but to participate in the system, and that's basically feudalism.
Right.
And I kind of it's a bit of an extremist position, but I see where they're at, right?
Mm-hmm.
I can get there from where I'm at. It wouldn't be impossible for us to get all the way back there, and I think that's kind of the path that maybe we're on. But there are these options, though, right? To redistribute the gains in a more equitable way, to enable people to fulfill themselves with like something real rather than this consumer thing. But it requires some pretty significant shifts.
Hmm.
So anyway, so these luxury communist people are all about that. And I only keyed onto what they've been thinking about since, like I said, the 70s, I think, only like a year or two ago. And I still haven't had the time to really go deep into what they
Mm-hmm.
are about. So this isn't necessarily an endorsement of their entire structure, but that resonated, right? That we should get to the point where work is really about um, what people would like to do, what people feel like they can contribute by doing, and to get rid of the stuff that's not
Yeah.
edifying to the human condition, right? So do we all end up being artists? I don't think so, but we might end up being people who take more time and energy in our relationships with other people, right? And technology is extraordinarily powerful and can be a force for good. I've worked in the technology space for forever and doing public policy related to it. And, my strongly held belief is that technology is a tool, right? And like all tools, it can be
Right.
used to help or to hurt people, basically. And so we're at an age of unprecedented advances in technology. We just have to figure out how we ensure that everybody benefits from it, right? Right now, we're doing a poor job of that,
Right.
and nobody's really coming along with a good model. I don't, the Europeans tried to be a bit more protectionist and tried to keep, some of the big dominant players from getting such a foothold, but I don't think they've been successful in arguing a real different model. The Chinese just simply chose who their winners would be and got behind them, right? Like it's not different fundamentally, right? The power still gets consolidated, and probably even more so because there's such a strong link between the state and industry. So, you know,
Right.
but somebody needs to develop that model and find the places on Earth that you could propagate it. but it has to happen soon, I think, and it has to happen in a big way, or we'll pass some.
Mhm. Yeah.
There's, I think, some inevitable tipping point where this gets, it's too much. I don't know what that looks like exactly. I don't know if that's an economic question or a political.
There becomes a point at which enough of the power is consolidated that the remaining power can't organize up against it.
Exactly right. Yeah. So this is not to pick on Google. I think Google does some fantastic things, but how easy is it for you to do something online, to have a presence online without being in some way linked into Google, right?
Right.
And there's a lot of companies we can say that about. I'll use them as an example because I think everybody will understand the ways that they're involved in their lives. There are other companies that are very involved that you don't see as visibly, but it's a small set of companies that have an incredible amount of control.
Right.
And if they decide that they don't like something, or if they decide they don't want to participate in a program, then they just kind of don't have to. They've put themselves on equal footing with states,
Right.
which isn't necessarily inappropriate. I mean, if you look at the amount of power and capability they have, in fact, they would be significant mid-sized states, right?
Right.
So it's not an inappropriate thing for them. It's a natural recognition of what they've become, but the problem is that they've kind of become that, right? So I don't know. That's where I'm at. I would love to see the off ramp from that current system onto something more edifying for people, right? That isn't about extracting all the value from people and their activities, but more about allowing people to develop their own values and to try to make the world a better place as they see it, or as the community sees it somehow. That's easy though, right? I'll bang out a white paper this week and we'll get that solved. Boy, to borrow a phrase from the first President Bush, lots of points of light out there that point in the right direction. I think. I hope our conversation is in that category. How to amplify those and how to drive people's attention to them and to help them understand that what they're giving up is nothing compared to what they get. It's an intangible thing. It's not reflected in your bank account or your relative social position, but it's somehow much much more. That's fundamentally, I think, the hard part, right? Is convincing people that giving up something kind of tangible is worth it for something wholly intangible, particularly for the people who have power and have accumulated status in the system, convincing them to give up, but it has to happen. I mean, I think there are a lot of facets of our society that are toxic and harmful in ways that we don't recognize, and that, we end up limiting ourselves as a civilization because we refuse to embrace some of these bigger things. But it's safety, right? Like, what's the people will give up an awful lot for a sense of security, and whatever status they accumulate, even if it's not much, makes people feel that way, right? It makes them feel like they've got something worth holding on to, and so why would I give up that, whatever it is, right?
Bird in the hand.
Exactly. We're taught that from childhood, right? It's literally one of Aesop's fables, so it's deeply ingrained in our cultural sort of psyche, particularly in the West. But I think it's true everywhere at this point. Capitalism in its various forms seems to have done that, and there are good things about capitalism, right? Let's not. I won't completely bash it. I think the democratic capitalist system, that particularly in its in its early 20th century formulations, contributed tremendously to lifting a lot of people out of poverty.
Right.
And if what we want for people is the opportunity for them to do what they want, then they have to be given some kind of breathing room, and poverty reduces that breathing room significantly. So, appropriate amount of appreciation for what we have, what we've done with it. But I think that it doesn't get us all the way home.
Right.
And if we want to go, I don't know that there's an end to the road. Frankly, I think it's a very long road. at the very least. We can't see the end, but if we want to go farther and a little bit faster, then capitalism's probably going to have to be dramatically reimagined or altogether done away with in favor of something more beneficial. So yeah, I mean, but that comes back to how do you articulate a political and economic organizational structure that you can migrate to? Not easy.
You should be struggling, 'cause we're all not suffering. You should be struggling, 'cause we're all not suffering. You should be struggling, 'cause we're all not suffering.
Is justice just a human phenomena? Something that we care about and we impose on a universe that is, I'm not going to say it's unjust, but it just doesn't care about justice? Does justice have something to do with the grain of the universe itself?
I have a hard time thinking that the universe is cold and unfeeling. And so it's easier for me to think that justice is part of the universe in some way.
Mm-hmm.
What that means when it's expanded out to a universal scale, boy, I think I could start thinking about those answers, but I'm not sure that I would like some of the places it would take me, because it would make me feel like I'm not being a just person, right? Particularly related to, environmental impacts and things like that. I mean, I think proper justice to the universe would go beyond just justice to mankind, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I don't think I'm perfect on that count alone, right? There's more I can do, but I recognize it and I try. But if I were to try to be just at a universal scale, the fruitarians, right? The guys that only eat fruit that falls off a tree because, I think you kind of go close to there pretty quick. And talk about uncomfortable things to give up in favor of a better way.
Yeah.
But you'd have to give up an awful lot if you wanted to be truly just to, right? And some of it would be detrimental to humankind, right?
Right.
We've promoted our species above the rest of the universe or the rest of the world in ways that are, deleterious to the health of sort of the global ecosystem.
And ultimately harmful to ourselves.
I think in the long run, yeah, we still don't recognize some of the long-term damage that we're doing here. I try to be conscious, but I can't be, I can't get a perfect score.
Yeah.
It would mean going back out into living in the woods and dying of a tooth infection or something, right? That's where you would, if you went to the extreme of it, right? Now, can you build perhaps a third way, so to speak, right? Maybe, right? Do we have to completely go back to living like all the other animals in this sort of loop that keeps sort of a stasis on Earth? Or can we do something better? I hope we can figure out something better, right? Something that lifts up some of the great things mankind has done and actually uses those to make the planet an even better place.
Yeah.
I think it's possible.
Find a way to live in harmony and still pursue the loftier parts of...
Yeah. But I mean, it comes at a cost, right? The first easy thing that a lot of people can do is reduce their consumption, particularly of meat, but just consumption in general of food, so that the strain on the ecosystem is less. We know that a lot of the deforestation in places like Brazil comes from cattle farming because people have an insatiable thirst for red meat. So, there are some pretty obvious things that we could just control today, right? That wouldn't be a complete giving up of what we have, but would be minimizing it, right?
Right.
I'm trying to reduce my own red meat intake, but it's more on an environmental concern than even a animal welfare kind of concern.
Right.
That's what drove me to that decision. I understand why people have that concern about animal welfare, though. I get it. But so can you take some of those steps? Move towards renewable energy, even if it costs us a little bit more in the short term? Yes.
Yeah.
Certainly, for those of us who can afford to put solar in our backyards or to buy an electric car, right? Like that's a luxury in and of itself. How do we make sure that those things are available to everybody? And then also, how do we switch to expecting it, right? So it's not just a choice that the elite can make, but it's just, of course, you use solar and not coal or diesel generators for your electric, right? There are plenty of statistics about how just simply having electric light in villages in Africa changes the educational attainment of kids, right? So I wouldn't want to go to the dark ages because I think that educational attainment leads to interesting things that are beneficial for society as a whole and possibly for the universe as a whole. So let's not cut that off. But
Right.
how do we get there in a way that isn't costing us more than what we're getting, right?
Right.
Or at least reducing the costs along the way. So I think that's what. Yeah, I mean the short answer to your question is I think that the universe has some sense of justice, right? I think that there is a generic sort of right and wrong. I think like there are situational issues that complicate things, make decisions become complicated. But objectively, some things are going to be better than others for the universe, and I think that as you said, the coexistence or harmony is an important facet of that, right? Like if we're promoting that, then we're probably more or less doing the just thing.
I like it.
Okay, good.
I like it. And when you touched on, like, is the universe cold and indifferent? I think that's ultimately a huge part of the question here.
Yeah.
Because for most of human history, we did not conceive of the universe that way.
Yeah.
Only recently have we slipped into a very different kind of view of the universe that's much more mechanical.
Mm-hmm.
And that changes how we think about issues like justice and all that, which
Yeah.
throughout all of human history have been tied up in the idea that somehow the universe has a vested interest in what happened.
Yeah. Well, it's a closed loop system, right? I mean, so a couple of thoughts, right? Part of what I think drives, at least in my case, a sense of the universe being vastly interconnected, or that all the elements of the universe are vastly interconnected, are some of them not even terribly recent at this point. Although, given sort of the environment we grew up in, I think we stumbled on them later. Developments in physics, right? Particularly like quantum physics and string theory, and this idea that things actually at a physical level are really all interconnected in a real way, which opens up the possibility for a sense of the universe as a whole, right?
Yeah.
The Star Wars fans would say, it's kind of the Force, right? It's probably imperfect, but it kind of gets a sense of what is there, right? That somehow all of the things that are, not just the things that live, but all of the things that are connected to each other in some way.
All of the mystics from all the different religious traditions seem
Mm-hmm.
to agree on that
Yeah,
at the very least.
right.
I am not at all a Luddite. I am pro science. Like, I'm horrified by some of the like anti science nonsense going on around us. I'm pro technology in a similar way that you are. Like, there are obvious risks, but look at the good we can do with it.
Right.
But also, there does seem to be a sense in which we have lost our rootedness.
Yeah.
We've lost some kind of experiential connection with whatever that mystery is that unites us. and makes us one with the universe.
Yeah, I think, that was probably the Enlightenment
Hmm.
focused so much on the individual.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a long philosophical, and some of it was beneficial. Going and studying the individual unit helped, I think, understand who we are as people and as even interconnected people. Certainly, a lot of useful work was done on individual things in physics, but it's really this kind of more recent bend has brought science and philosophy and culture and economics back to this sense of interconnectedness. So I think, it was a good detour, right? We got some stuff out, but we're back on what I think is probably the right path.
I hope so.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, I mean, there probably will be more detours long run of things. It's hard for us to connect viscerally or emotionally to pre-enlightenment people, right?
Yes.
Like our history really kind of starts there.
Yeah, we're irrevocably Enlightenment people.
And so, while we have like an academic sense that yes, okay, previous civilizations thought about interconnectedness and the mystics have always been there, but like it's hard for us to really be like, yeah, but here's the one guy who wrote this book about it, right? It just wasn't that way. And so we still kind of use enlightenment kind of tools like the one guy who writes the one book to get us back to this interconnected stuff, right? Whereas I think we kind of, and I think you alluded to it a little bit, that sometimes it's not about the single point of evidence you can point to that helps you understand this, right? It's
Hmm.
sort of a general sense of what becomes self-evident once it's revealed, right? Like it just appears, and
Yeah.
you go, yeah, this is real. I think we're coming back to that. Like as a society, we're moving back in the direction of being able to accept what just sort of appears. Now, there's a downside to it too, right? Like
Hmm.
when it goes wrong, it goes really wrong.
Yeah.
For better or for worse, we've moved beyond the need for facts in our political discourse, right? Without going into sort of the postmodernist, scare that was beaten into us as undergrads. Some of that's true, right? Like if we move too far away from some of the things that can be backed up with objective facts, then you end up in some tricky situations. How do you separate, when it's the right time to appeal to facts and to reasoning and logic to drive a decision versus when it's just a thing that is true in your heart?
I think that's going to be one of the wisdom questions in the next couple generations. Like we're going to have to explore that together.
Yeah, I can see the question, but I have no idea about the answer.
Yeah, I have no clue. No clue.
And that's where I think, yeah, you're right. That will be what separates, the truly like wise people in this transition period, which I think we're in, right?
Hmm.
To what we're transitioning, we still don't know, but I think clearly, we're not in a period that looks like what we grew up in,
Right.
right? We're in something that's, I think, pretty fundamentally different. So a lot of the old rules just aren't going to apply, and I think people who can figure out how to use the space and the tensions between those two pieces, right, are
Hmm.
going to be wildly successful at whatever they attempt to do, whether that's creating or explaining or malicious use too, frankly.
That was so much more than I expected and beautiful. I am
Oh,
so glad that we had that conversation.
likewise.
Who has God been for you lately?
Mm, that's a tough one. I mean, like the number of like explosive little thoughts happening across my brain just thinking about that question is pretty overwhelming. Um, so here's a boy. This could really end up being super sappy. So forgive me in advance.
We've been so intellectual the whole time. I think a little bit of sap is going to be fine.
Okay. So I was at my friend's wedding 2 weekends ago, and it was just incredible to see the love that they're both my friend, but the groom in particular is a long term friend of mine. And the love that he has for his wife, and the things that they've overcome together. Just watching, taking a step back during the wedding ceremony to kind of think about everything they've done and realizing that love somehow is worth more when you have to fight for it.
Yeah.
That there's wasn't necessarily an easy thing from the outset, wasn't a given foregone conclusion. So seeing that, at the very least, I can say it was a deeply spiritual moment for me to sort of experience that, right? To have that vibe with the universe. Just to be around, and in my own case, being in love and being a husband, to be around people that are doing that, right? That are constructing in that way, I think that's what's been God for me lately. So it comes back to this idea of like generative love, right?
Yeah.
Are you building something, and is there not just reciprocity? I think that's two-dimensional, right? But are both people pouring into the structure of the thing in some way? And yeah, that's where I would say I've seen God in the face of the universe lately, for sure.
That's perfect. Ryan, that was everything I could hope for and more.
Good. I'm glad it was useful.
Yeah, thank you for the conversation. I feel like it was affirming several really clear and solid and noble things.
Well, you got me thinking with the sort of teaser questions the other day.
Yeah.
A lot of it's stuff that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. It's all unstructured in my mind, right? Like there's a piece over here that talks about justice, and I kind of have developed some thoughts about it. And there's some stuff over here about love and some stuff over here about, and I'm left with something that I think is true and beautiful. How do I start putting them together? Not that it has to be a tidy construct either, right? I don't know that I need that, first off, and I don't know that it ends up being that, right? Like that's, so that I don't want it to become I don't need a structured religion made out of these things, because I think that's replacing something that didn't work with something that will inevitably probably not work because I'm shoehorning it. But how do I explore the inner linkages between them? That's where I get to spend my favorite time right now, in my head. I'm going to get to go. Here's how you get to the bedrock of all knowledge. Do nothing. Just wait for it.
That's it for episode 1 of Skeptic Site. You can find me on Twitter at skeptic_monk. Thanks for listening.